Hello dear friends, welcome and welcome back. Today we make an art journal page with stamps from Aallandcreate, and I will link to them at Sarisstampingstudio in the description box below. Today we start with my die cutting machine, craft cardstock and an embossing folder from Tim Holtz and Sizzix called Lumber. I have this little bottle with water and a drop of fabric softener, and I use it to spray cardstock before I put it in my embossing folder to avoid tearing, and the cardstock smells amazing. And while the cardstock doesn't tear when embossing it, it is moist and can break if not handled with care. I run the embossing folder through my die cutting machine and get this lovely wood grain paper. To enhance the feeling of real wood, I use distress ink in Vintage Photo and blend it in from the sides and over the raised parts of the wood. Then I use archival ink in Black Soot to darken the edges and bring out those wood grains even more. I'm working in my small dialog Dylusions journal. I'm using the typewriter from this stamp set. I have used it before, and I am always happy when older stamp set comes to be used in new ways. I place my journal in my stamping platform because I want a good impression. I place my stamp carefully in my journal and stamp in VersaFine Clear Nocturne ink. And then I cover my image with Wow's Clear Matte Dull embossing powder. When the image is covered in embossing powder, I bring out a Christmas gift from this year. It is Wow's heat tool, and I melt the powder faster than ever before. Next, I am using a stamp set that is new to me, and I choose to go with the Aall. I put it in my stamping platform, stamp in VersaFine Clear Nocturne ink, and cover in Wow's Clear Matte Dull embossing powder and melt it. And I will do this heat embossing procedure for every image in this project. You can of course use any clear embossing powder. This matte powder is just what I prefer this time. Since I have heat embossed the typewriter, I can add ink over it and it will resist the ink. This time I'm doing ink smooshing with a piece of plastic packaging / acetate, and I will smoosh the inks on the acetate, spray with water and smoosh the acetate on my pages. I'm using distress inks in Rustic Wilderness, Pine Needle and Forest Moss, and I just love these yummy green colors smooshed together. The colors are so mesmerizing, and I just continue to add green ink, smooshing it on my pages until I'm happy. I give the pages a quick dry before I continue with two red inks, Fired Brick and Aged Mahogany, and the Black Soot Distress Oxide ink, and I add these new colors because they will tie my images and background together later. Next, we are coloring the owl, starting with the wood behind. I start with Vintage Photo, adding it where I want my shadows, and filling in the rest with Vintage Photo diluted with water. Then I add ground espresso to darken the shadows around the owl before I blend out any harsh lines with that diluted Vintage Photo again. Next, we are coloring the flowers or leaves around the owl, and I bring in the light Twisted Citron to contrast the dark green colors. First I color in the leaves with Twisted Citron, then I add shadows with Rustic Wilderness. Next I use a diluted Twisted Citron to blend the dark and light together. Then I do the same with pine needle and forest moss. I use them to deepen the shadows in between the dark greens. I use twisted citron to blend out harsh lines. To color the owl, I'm using 2 reds, fired brick and aged mahogany, and the brown vintage photo. I use the lightest, fired brick, to map out my shadows and fill in the rest with a more diluted fired brick. Then I deepen the shadows, first with aged mahogany and then vintage photo, and blend them together with that diluted fired brick again. And around the eyes I use a diluted vintage photo. Next up, we need a layer between the background, the wood and the owl, so I use the same technique as I did on the background. I smoosh the green inks on the acetate, spray with water and smoosh. And to add the red and black ink, I smoosh those ink pads on my glass mat and dip my scrap piece of cardstock in the ink. To make the layers I'm talking about, I bring out my die cutting machine again, along with some circle dies with stitch details, and I use the largest circle to cut out a circle from the wood panel, and the slightly smaller circle to cut a circle from the green panel. When I have the green circle, I discover that too little wood is peeking out behind the green circle, so I bring out a smaller circle and cut another green one, and with that circle I feel much better. Off camera, I stamped and heat embossed another typewriter, and now I need to give it some color. I use distress ink in vintage photo to add an old feeling to the paper in the typewriter. Then I bring out a silver gelato to color the rest, but I found the silver too cold for my background and it doesn't feel right. So I bring out a distress crayon called Tarnished Brass and scribble it on before I spread it out with a wet brush, and immediately I feel better. Next, I need one more element for my pages, and the choice fell on these beautiful flowers. And I do the same as before and heat emboss the flowers with Wow's Clear Matte Dull embossing powder. To color the flowers, I use the same color combo as I did on the owl, but I also bring in the dark orange crackling campfire to act as a highlight, and I do the same as I always do. I color the flower in the lightest crackling campfire and add shadows from the center of the flower with fired brick and aged mahogany. For the leaves I used a diluted rustic wilderness and add shadows with pine needle and forest moss. Before I put these pages together, I need a sentiment, and for that I chose words from yet another stamp set saying be quirky, bold and beautiful. I already had the word be stamped with an alphabet set because I love to mix fonts. And I heat emboss the words the same way as before on a cardstock strip. I cut my sentiment into 3 strips and use vintage photo ink to darken the edges, and then I use black soot archival ink to darken the edges even more and make the strips fit on my pages. It's now time to put all these elements together into journal pages, and I start with the typewriter, putting foam tape behind it, popping it over the heat embossed image on my background. And then I add 2 words that I cut out from that second image. Next I put 2 of the small red flowers and a leaf sticking out behind the typewriter. On the other page I take the big red flower and glue it flat in the middle of the page. I put foam tape behind the wood circle and pop it over the stem of the flower. I do the same with the green circle and put it in the center of the wood circle. Next I glue down 1 more flower and 1 leaf around the big flower stem. I glue down my leading role, the owl, flat on the 2 circles. To make the words stand out, I pop them up on foam tape and glue them on my first page. Finally, because I can't help it, I go around the pages with black ink. And now, these mixed media art journal pages are finished. I am so grateful that you have been with me this far, and I wish you all the most wonderful end to 2021. Until the next time, Happy New Year!